Good morning, everyone. This morning we're going to be looking at Matthew chapter 8. We went over it in the Bible class, and now we're going to get in a little bit deeper. It's chapter 8 is really starting a kind of a new section, but it's very much related to what has just happened. And this is a kind of famous painting from. Oh, you can't really see it on the projector. You can see it on the computer pretty good, though. So everybody watching on YouTube can see it pretty well. It's a boat with a sail up, and there's big waves that are crashing over it. And the painter's name is Ludolf Backhuizen, and it's called "The Christ in the Storm on the Sea of Galilee." And it was painted in 1695 in the Baroque style. I kind of liked it, this picture, and so I used it. But let's get back to the story here of what's going on, what has been going on since chapter 4. I think if we really think about it, on any given day, when we ask ourselves what's going on with Jesus, you would hear him announcing the nearness of the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven, like Matthew calls it, and that the kingdom was here in himself and what he was doing. And so this is what Matthew is going to explore for the next 3 chapters now, 8, 9, and really 10 as well, but 5, 6, 7 kind of function as a unit, and then 8 and 9 function as a unit. And there's a saying that happens at the end of 9 and the beginning of right before chapter 5 that really kind of bracket it into one group. And of course, you've heard me say it, I don't know how many times. Chapter 4 in verse 23, what was Jesus doing? And Jesus was going around and about Galilee, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom and healing every kind of sickness among the people. And then in chapter 9, at the end of chapter 9, we find the same exact words used. In verse 35, it says, and Jesus was going about all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom, and healing every kind of disease. So he's teaching, he's proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom, and he's healing every kind of disease. And so any given day, you could hear Jesus teaching the gospel of the kingdom or healing. And so this is what Matthew is going to really kind of explore for us about what it means to enter into the life of God's kingdom. So he's been teaching about it in chapters 5, 6, and 7. He's been teaching theoretical, this is what you need to do. Blessed are these people who do these things. Now he's going to go out and actually do those things. And so this is the conclusion of the lesson that was on the mountain, right? We call it the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew has reported to us this astonished reaction of the crowd at the end of chapter 7. He says the result was that as Jesus had finished these words, the multitudes were amazed at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one having authority and not as their scribes. But Jesus didn't come only to teach. And this introductory paragraph that we just read in chapter 4 has focused even more strongly, possibly, on his acts of healing, his acts of power. And primarily, when we talk about acts of power, we're talking about healing and exorcism. And so the healing and the exorcism aspect of Jesus' ministry are some of the main components. And they're really the basis of his widespread reputation around the area of Galilee, right? It's not necessarily him saying, blessed are the peacemakers, that made him famous, right? The things that made him most famous, that people are remembering, is the healing and the exorcism of the evil or demons. It depends on how you want to label it. We're going to get into that, kind of scratch the surface of what it might mean to have a demon or to be possessed. But let's just now think and remember that these are some of the main components of Jesus' miraculous activity in the area. And that the events of chapters 8 and 9, even though they're not teaching events necessarily, he's not giving a lesson, a sermon, they are a parallel collection of events that happen in the same area as the Sermon on the Mount. So this collection is going to provide the basis for Jesus' claim to being the Christ, to being the Messiah that Matthew claimed that he was in chapter 1, to being God with us, Emmanuel, right? And this is all going to be based on his miraculous acts of what's going on. Of course, the disciples don't grasp the full revelation of what's going on here until a little bit later, maybe chapter 11. Let me look at chapter 11 real quick. I wanted to read something. Yeah, when John is asking, he sent word to his disciples and said to him, "Are you the expected one, or should we look for someone else?" And Jesus answered him and said, "Yes, I'm the expected one," right? That's not what he says. But what he says is the same thing. And this is important to realize that when Jesus says these things, the way Matthew records them for us, it's not yes or no answers, but it's in the form of a story. It's in the form of events. And so when Matthew puts Jesus into the place of controlling the winds and the waves, he's putting him into the place of Yahweh, the God of the Old Testament, the one true God of Israel, because that's the only one who can control the winds and the waves. So when John asked that question, "Are you the expected one?" Jesus answered and said to them, "Go and report to John what you hear and what you see." These miracles that happen here in chapters 8 and 9 are what they heard and what they saw. And John knew that Jesus was the Christ because of the miracles that happened here in chapters 8 and 9. So let's get into it and see how we can know that Jesus is the Christ. This is the general outline of the chapter. Chapters 8 and 9 are kind of providing this sort of slice of life, this sort of everyday life, what's going on in Jesus' life and his overall ministry. They contain fully half of all of the miracles in Matthew are in these next two chapters. There's 10 miracles, but they're grouped into three groups of three, and two of the miracles happen at the same time. So it's really kind of 9 miracles grouped into three groups of three. And this is Jesus bringing the kingdom from the words of chapters 5, 6, and 7 into actions and reality. Jesus is traveling from town to town, healing and exorcising demons, and we often tend to think of the kingdom as something sort of abstract, something in the future. I'm not sure what that is sometimes, or sometimes we go the other way and we try to make it too concrete, that the kingdom is only the people of God, is only this thing, and then we forget about what it means to have God ruling over us. And in some ways it is abstract, but it also the kingdom also is made up of concrete actions that are results of living under the kingship of the Messiah. And that's what's going on here in chapters 8 and 9. There's 9 separate miracle stories that have 10 individual miracles, like I said, and they're arranged into 3 groups of 3. And between those 3 groups, so there's 3 groups of 3, and in between those 3 groups, we have 2 narrative sections, so they're storytelling sections, and they both focus on the call to discipleship and the response of individuals to that call. Let's back up. We just talked about John asking if Jesus was the one. He said, "By these things you should know if I'm the one or not." If he is the one, we need to be the one. We need to be following him. And so John is going to become Jesus' disciple now. And that radical call to discipleship that Jesus is making is uncompromising. We're going to get to that. Let me just sift through my notes here because I'm trying to make this a little bit shorter. Got a little bit long in the intro there. and this is going to be a little bit long of a lesson. So the discipleship theme here of chapters 5 through 7 is now going to be shown in these case studies that allow us, the reader, to think more deeply about the challenge that Jesus issued to us in chapter 7. Half of chapter 7 is about our actions in response to the kingdom of heaven, in response to Jesus bringing the kingdom into reality in his actions. We need to think more deeply about our own response, right? He says, enter by the narrow gate. A tree is known by its fruits. You need to build on the correct foundation. These are all actions that we have to do. And so it allows us to be more deeply surrounded by stories that are growing, increasingly. They're increasingly highlighting and underlining this unique authority of Jesus, the one who has issued that call. So as that authority is more and more shown to us, we realize the power of what Jesus is demanding, that it suddenly discipleship is now going to be even more important than family. It's going to be more important than, well, let me just get into some of these things. The first one here is the leper. We look at, and I've got quite a bit here on the leper because there's a lot of meaning. And I think it's first in Matthew's account of what's going on because of the importance. We find the same story in Mark and also in Luke. It's in a little different order there of what's going on. So we know things are not necessarily chronological in the Gospels. They're told by the way the writer wanted to tell them. It wasn't necessarily chronological. So let's look at verse 2 and see how this person approaches Jesus, and he says something, just profound and really remarkable. Let me just read verse 1 and 2. It says, and when he came down from the mountain, the great multitudes followed him, and behold, a leper came to him. I didn't make it very far, verse 2. Why did the leper have to come to him? Because he wasn't allowed into society. So that's the first law that's been broken. And he bowed down to him, saying, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. He says something amazing there. He doesn't say, Lord, can you heal me? How many of us here, when we read that, we understood it to mean, if you're able, make me clean? That's sometimes when we read this, we read through it very quickly and we think that's what he says, but that's not what he says, right? Do you see the difference of what he says? Most of us wonder sometimes if Jesus is capable of doing anything about our problems or our situation. We've got this really complicated relationship with somebody and things are not going well, and we wonder if that relationship is going to work out, or if I should bring it to God, or if he can do anything about it. But that's not this guy's question. This guy recognizes the authority of Jesus, but he isn't sure of his character. This guy isn't sure if Jesus is good or compassionate. He knows he can heal. He knows he has the ability, but he isn't sure of the character of Christ. And so there's lots of types of uncleanness. Let me just hit this real quick so we can understand where we're coming from. But there's lots of types of uncleanness that could happen. And it didn't necessarily mean you were guilty of anything, right? You could touch an unclean creature. Maybe you were trying to get them out of your yard or something. Or a dead body. Maybe a relative of yours died. That would make you unclean. Or bodily discharges. The point that I'm trying to make here is that almost all of these are temporary. And so with this condition, what the Bible calls leprosy, what we now know is more than just one specific disease, but it was possibly a range of skin diseases. With this condition, it was different. As long as the skin condition persisted, the person had no place in society. and they had to figure out how to exist away from other people. And if you want to read the laws on that, that's Leviticus 13 and 14, or the skin disease laws. And so there's a possibility that this man had not felt the touch of another person in years. Yet Matthew focuses on this specific, compassionate character trait of Jesus that was willing to touch this man that no one wanted to touch, that the law said you couldn't touch. And why does Matthew choose to give this story first for us? I believe he did it because it was a category breaker. They had categories for what it meant to be unclean, and they had the blinders on because they saw the letter of the law, but they didn't see the intent of the law. Look at what the man says again. He doesn't ask to be healed. He asks to be made clean. These stories have so much symbolic baggage, freight that they're bringing in from the Hebrew storytelling context. And so this story is about Jesus's contagious holiness. Jesus, God is holy. Let me back up. Leviticus 4, right? God says, I am holy, therefore you must be holy. And so Jesus comes to embody the healing power of God's holiness, bringing people back into a covenant relationship with Him. That man could not worship the way the law prescribed. He could not have a full relationship with God. He couldn't go and make sacrifice. He couldn't go and be around people. Right? This person, he could have had good personal hygiene. He wasn't dirty on the outside necessarily, right? He could have brushed his teeth and combed his hair and still been unclean. He's not actually dirty. So when he comes to Christ, he asks to become clean, though. And so no other diseases carried this stigma that this man has. And so you can understand now the horror that people had when they saw a leper and the way they regarded this person. Let me make a comparison to a comparable disease today that people have horror when they see or hear about it. What about AIDS? What about AIDS? And I think that is a very important point to reflect on, that Jesus did not push this person away. They did not shame the person for catching a disease or even making poor decisions to get that disease. Jesus didn't push this person away, but he was willing to make that person clean. Not just heal them, but make that person clean. And so to cure this type of skin disease was on the same level as raising the people from the dead in 2 Kings. 2 Kings. You remember the story of, which story I'm going to? 2 Kings, we're going to the story of Naaman, right? The leper who God tells to dip in the ocean, 2 Kings chapter 5, in verse 7. And what's the king's response when Naaman, the great mighty man, asks to be healed of leprosy of the king of Israel? And it came about when Hiram heard the words of Solomon. Oh, wait, I'm in 1 Kings. Let's try that again. 1 Kings, let's try 2 Kings. Chapter 5, verse 7. And when it came about, when the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his clothes and said, Am I God to kill and make alive, that this man is sending word to me to cure this man of leprosy? The king here, it's not named, it's possibly Jehoram. The king here considered it the same as making a man alive. Same as raising him from the dead. And so the New Testament consistently describes lepers as being made clean, whereas other diseases are cured. And so both Jesus and the man broke these social taboos, if not the letter of the law, right? Leviticus 5:3. But Jesus was upholding the higher purpose of the law. So did he really break it? And that higher purpose of the law is that God desired mercy and not sacrifice. That's what Matthew chapter 15 and verse 11 is all about. When the paralytic is healed in the next chapter, Jesus says, so that you know the Son of Man has the power to forgive sin. What forgave sin under the law? Blood sacrifice did. But Jesus said he had the authority to forgive sin while on earth. These are things that were category breakers for them. They didn't understand how it could be that this person, this man, could have these powers, because who had the power to do those things? Yahweh, the Lord in the Old Testament. Every time you see Lord in your Bible, it's all caps in the Old Testament. That's the Tetragrammaton. Those 4 letters are, supposedly unpronounceable, that we sometimes say Yahweh is how to pronounce them. So, let's keep going and look at the next example, the centurion's servant. This is good. We're moving a lot faster than I thought we would. Matthew chapter 8, and the important part here, I'm going to skip right to it, is verses 11 and 12. And I think it's important that we notice what is going on here. We have a Gentile commander of a Gentile army. He's a centurion. He's over, supposedly 100 people. Could have been more, could have been less. And what we get from this story, remember, these stories are telling us something. The first one was the fact that Jesus is able to make clean people. He has the power to do that. Now Jesus is going to say he has the power to add people to his kingdom that were not originally in the kingdom. I mean, he says it very directly here. And so Matthew 11 and 12 are some of the clearest statements in Matthew that describe what Matthew understands about the relationship between Israel and the new community that is going to result from the ministry of Jesus, and how that continues on that tradition of God's chosen people. And so Matthew adds emphasis to this story of the centurion by including it in the context of the Gentiles' officer faith, which no one in Israel could match. The fact that no one in Israel's faith could match the centurion's faith, it's just emphasizing what's going on here. And so the story has a vision of what's going on in the future. Let me just read some of it real quick. Chapter 8 and verse 10. Truly I say to you, I have not found such great faith with anyone in Israel. And I say to you that many shall come from the east and the west and recline at the table with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the sons of the kingdom shall be cast into the outer darkness. In that place there shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And Jesus said to the centurion, Go your way, let it be done to you as you have believed. And the servant was healed that very hour. Matthew adds that little tidbit there at the end that other people don't. So we know what's going on. He tells us, because he's writing this later on, after these events happen. He's not journaling this necessarily as it's happening. And so the story's vision of the Messianic feast. Let me back up and give you, sorry, I'm getting off topic with my notes here. Let me just go by the notes because I got the storyline. The story has a vision of the kingdom of heaven, and it's gonna combine elements of continuity and discontinuity in the story. And the continuity part is that the Hebrew patriarchs are at the head of this table in the Messianic banquet, and that is fully what they expected. They expected there to be this Messianic banquet and that the Lord would gather his people again into a single unit, into a one nation again, and that the patriarchs would be there, and that all of the the faithful of God's children, of Abraham's children, would be there. But there's an element of discontinuity here also, in that the new people are going to come from the east and the west, those who don't belong to the kingdom of heaven. Because those who belong to the kingdom of heaven find themselves thrown out. They're exiled into a place that's traditionally reserved for Gentiles, right? And so it's here in Matthew chapter 8 that we're going to find for the first time a basic outline of a theology of the people of God, which is going to be worked out through the confrontation with the Jewish leadership in chapters 21 through 23. Jesus is going to confront them and say, the kingdom has been removed from you, right? And he's going to explain in symbolic language in the end of the sermon at the end of the old order, the end of the sermon at the end of 24 and 25, he's going to explain how the old order is done with. The temple will be torn down and will be built up in 3 days. And it's going to be and that's going to be triumphantly displayed to the entire world through the command to go and make disciples of all nations in chapter 28 and verse 19. And so we really shouldn't be surprised that the Gentiles are going to be coming into the kingdom, because Gentiles were some of the first people to welcome his coming, right? The wise men, quote unquote, from the east. And so we have the centurion's servant. Now let's look at the Peter's mother-in-law. This is just a little 1 or 2 lines here, so for the sake of time, we'll skip the actual healing of Peter's mother, but I think you get the idea of what's going on. Healing the people, whether it's making them clean like the leper, or giving the basic outline for how all of humanity is going to be saved in the story of the centurion, the purpose of these stories is this, that God, who is the author of life, has taken up residence physically here in the middle of the people of Israel. And so we're going to honor that presence by keeping anything away that would defile that presence, right? And it was not, for the most part, wrong to be sinful. It was not sinful to be unclean. You might have done something wrong possibly to get there, but being unclean was not equated with sinfulness under the old covenant. Jesus had come to heal the brokenness and unholiness and uncleanness of our spirits. He's come to call those people who are outcasts, who are on the margins of society like the leper, who couldn't be part of society, like the Gentile who couldn't be part of the people of Israel. And he came to call them into a close fellowship with himself. And that often gets messy. It gets really messy. It involves messy people. It involves messy life choices. It involves messy relationships. But like the leper, Jesus is willing to make you clean. In the previous system, when we're talking about the old covenant, the uncleanness, the evil would spread. And whether that was through diseases or whether that was through touching something, it would spread. But now God's holiness is contagious. We see that the leper is now being cleansed by someone touching him, whereas before, if he touched somebody, the uncleanness spread. But now God's holiness is contagious. And if you want to read more on that, read chapter 6. Let me just look at it real quick with you, because it's such a profound thing in Isaiah chapter 6, I should say. Isaiah chapter 6, because sometimes we skip over this, we don't understand what's going on, and a lot of crazy things going on in Isaiah, but let me just read a couple things. In the year of the king Uzziah's death, I saw the Lord sitting on the throne. That should be setting off alarm bells in your mind. Who has seen the Lord and survived? No one. So that should be setting off alarm bells. In the year of King Uzziah's death, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne, lofty and exalted, with the train of his robe filling the temple. And so God is sitting on his throne in heaven, and it's connected to earth through the train of his robe. The glory of his robe connects heaven and earth. And his robe filled the temple. Remember the glory cloud that filled the temple? Seraphim stood above him, each having 6 wings. Let me just back up. These are not human creatures. Human creatures in the Bible never have wings. Never. There's no creatures in the Bible that have wings that are human-like. Let me just tell you right now. Seraphim stood above him, each having 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. And one called out to another, and he said, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory." And the foundations of the thresholds tremble at the voice of him who called out. That sounds a little scary. That sounds a lot scary. And what is Isaiah's reaction? What is Isaiah's reaction? He says, "Woe is me! Behold, I am a man of unclean lips. I live among a people of unclean lips. For mine eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts." Then one of the seraphim flew to me with a burning coal in his hand, which he had taken from the altar with tongs. And he touched my mouth with it and said, "Behold, this has touched your lips, and your iniquity is taken away. Your sin is forgiven." Sounds pretty simple, right? He's cleansed. He's made clean. Do you think that was a painful process? I don't know about you, but last time coal touched my lips, it was from a flaming marshmallow, and I thought I was going to die because it was hot. This doesn't even compare to what's going on here. Isaiah is afraid he's going to be burnt to a crisp. He has just seen the Lord, and he's unclean. This is the level of concern that these people had, and the level of righteousness that God demands from them. And so Jesus has come to heal that uncleanness, that brokenness, that unholiness. He's come to call those outcast people into that fellowship with him. And that is not always a nice process. It's not always a painless process like it was for Isaiah. God's holiness is profound, and it can be painful as it burns away and it purges us of our sin. But it also has the power to transform us completely, like the leper, right? He's clean. He can worship God in the temple now. He can be a part of society. He is back into that full covenant relationship with God. Like Isaiah, he can have that close relationship with God. Let's keep going, because we got a couple more things going on in the chapter. I have them broken up, and I don't have them broken up not chronologically. What's the word? Consecutively. I have them out of order, just for my own ease of telling you the story here of what's going on. So previously we have healing. Now we have Jesus's command over the elements. This time it's the sea, and the calming of the sea and the casting out of the demon, I want to show you, are a very closely related stories. And so in these last 2 sections they're closely related to Jesus' power over the elements, whether that's the exorcism of demons in Matthew, or the calming of at the end of 8, or it's the calming of the sea. Matthew he's making some really super important claims about Jesus' identity, about who he is, even more so than maybe not more so than the leper, but on par with his claims about making the leper clean. Jesus is saying, Matthew is saying certain things about Jesus here. He isn't just trying to show us the power of Jesus and say, yep, he's a good moral teacher who has a lot of power, and then ends the story there. That's not what Matthew's trying to do. This story ends with a question. The story of the calming of the sea. This story ends with a question that says, what sort of man is this that even the winds and the sea obey him? Right? And Matthew then answers and says, this is the Son of God. It is God become man. No, he doesn't say that. He says it in the form of narrative. Just like when he answers John in Matthew chapter 11, when he asks if Jesus is the expected one. And this is profound. Jesus broke every category that they thought they understood about God. They thought they understood the law and what it meant to treat a leper, to move them outside of the camp. But they didn't understand that God cared about the person, who wanted the healing for the person, and that these are not supposed to be destitute people out here. We're supposed to be taking care of those people. And so the story here starts on the water. They're in a boat. And the next one ends in the water as well, right, with the drowning of the pigs. And there's a sort of arc in between them that connects these two stories. And we're going to see how they begin to fit together, right? And to do that, we really have to back up and see the importance of water in the biblical story, and particularly in the story of Israel and how they saw themselves. So to do that, we're going to go to Exodus chapter 14. And let's look at the foundational story of how Israel saw themselves. Exodus chapter 14. Did you know that Passover is one of the oldest continuously celebrated religious observances in the world that has ever existed? For 3,000 years or more, the Jews have been celebrating Passover. I mean, that is mind-boggling. Let's look at the actual story of what's going on here. So, by this time they've already left Egypt, right? So they think they're saved, but then they hear that Pharaoh is following them. Let's read verse 1 through 4 here. Now the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, tell the sons of Israel to turn back and camp before Pi-hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea, and you shall camp in front of Baal-zephon, opposite of it, by the sea. God told Moses to go down to the water where they would be hemmed in, where they had no other option to get away from Pharaoh. For Pharaoh will say to the sons of Israel, they are wandering aimlessly in the land, and the wilderness has shut them in. They have no way around. Wherever this is, they have no way out. It's through the water or through Pharaoh. Thus I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will chase after them, and I will be honored through Pharaoh and all his army, and the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord. And they did so. What's happening here? They go down to the water, just like God says, but what actually happens? What actually happens is they see Pharaoh, and they're terrified. Let me flip the page here. Verse 11. Then they said to Moses, is it because there were no graves in Egypt that you have brought us away to die in the wilderness? Why have you dealt with us in this way, bringing us out of Egypt? Verse 13. But Moses said to the people, do not fear. Stand by and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will accomplish for you here today. For the Egyptians whom you have seen today, you will never see again forever. And the Lord will fight for you while you keep silent. This is about the salvation of God for the people of Israel. So when they're in that boat and don't see the bigger picture of the salvation for his people that Jesus was bringing, and the fact that God would not allow his son to die in that situation, they've missed the big picture. And so the salvation of the Lord is exactly what happens in verse 21 and 22. And then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord swept the sea back by a strong east wind all night and turned the sea into dry land, and the waters were divided. And the sons of Israel went through the midst of the sea on dry land, and the waters were like a wall to them on their right hand and on the left. Yahweh has created a path through the waters to salvation. The Lord, Yahweh, has created a path through the waters. Yahweh, their God, has tamed the sea. That is what has happened. And so when Israel celebrates Passover, they're celebrating how God led them away from danger through the chaotic waters and into a special relationship with Himself. Remember, there's a strong wind that's blowing up this wall of water. It's still chaotic, but they're walking on dry land through faith. This is the foundational story of Israel. And so the Bible authors are constantly making reference to water as a type of chaos that God provides us a way through. And this is just one example here. If you want to look at a lot more, I really recommend you look at Psalm 65, Psalm 69, Psalm 89, and we're going to look at Psalm 105 here on the next slide. But as an example here on the back of one of my business cards here, we have Psalm 65, verses 5 and 7. It says, "By awesome deeds you answer us in righteousness, O God of our salvation. You who are the trust of all the ends of the earth and the furthest sea, who establishes the mountains by His strength, being girded with might, who stills the roaring of the seas." Who stills the roaring of the seas? O God of our salvation, that's who. The roaring of the waves and the tumult of the peoples. The God of our salvation stills the sea. Who stills the sea in this story? Jesus does. Jesus is the God of our salvation. That is why Matthew has this story here. Let's look at Psalm 105 or 106 real quick. I'll try and move through this kind of quickly because we're getting kind of long in the lesson here, but we're getting there. Psalm 106, and I'll read verses 8 through 12. He has, 106. Nevertheless, He saved them for the sake of His name, that He might make His power known. Thus He rebuked the Red Sea, and it dried up. He led them through the deeps as through the wilderness. He saved them out of the hand of the one who hated them, and redeemed them from the hand of the enemy. The waters covered their adversaries, and not one of them was left. And they believed His words, and they sang His praise. Verse 13 starts a different section. They quickly forgot His works, is how it starts. We live in a town that's very close to the sea, and I made this example in Bible class, so I'll probably skip over some of the parts of it, but we live in a town that's very close to the sea. We understand the power of the sea. In a city, sometimes you forget that. We have air conditioning, and especially in Alaska, we have heating, and we have a roof over our head to keep the rain out. Did any one of us here go on a boat ride yesterday? I don't think so, right? It was blowing 50 miles an hour yesterday, literally. It was blowing gusts up to 50 yesterday, for those who don't live here. So this is the power that God has, that Yahweh has, that the Lord has. Even power to still those chaotic waters. And so Jesus is bringing that power, the power of the kingdom and a rule of God, down off of this mountain out of the classroom and into reality. And just for context, the Sea of Galilee is only about 7 or 8 miles wide, and it's in this valley where the cool air of the Mediterranean meets the hot air of the Iraqi and Syrian deserts. Those are, modern countries. And they meet, and what happens? Well, storms, that's what happens. And so the disciples think that they're dying, and that Jesus thinks that that's a good time for a mini lecture. Right, is when they're dying. And so this story also reminds us of Jonah, right? Who had to be awakened during a storm. But unlike Jonah, Jesus will prove to take charge of the situation, right? Jesus is going to use his own authority rather than praying to God for help. And so we're going to see in a few weeks in Matthew chapter 12, when it says that something greater than Jonah is here. It's not that the danger wasn't real, right? These are experienced old salt fishermen. These people have grown up on the water. Peter and Andrew, James and John, they're all fishermen. They're experienced in this area of fishing, also in the Galilean region. They would probably know when they were in serious danger. And so Jesus' confident rebuke of the storm, fully expecting it to recognize his authority, and the immediate calm that results from that authority, show that Jesus has the Creator's power. Who else rebukes the sea, right? Matthew is using language from the Exodus story. He is weaving the foundational story of Israel into what Jesus is doing. And that the God of Israel that saved Israel from Pharaoh is the same one who is rebuking the sea. Israel is crying out for deliverance, just like his disciples are crying out for deliverance. Who is the one with the power to calm the sea and to make the way through it? It's Yahweh, the one true God of Israel. He is the one who controls the sea. And look how they respond. They marveled. And Matthew chose this particular method here of storytelling to say this one theological point, that Jesus is the one true God become human to provide salvation for all of humanity. And Matthew puts Jesus in the God role, or in that role that is only filled by the one true God of Israel. Let me read, let's go back to chapter 8 here of Matthew and see how these two stories are connected. How is calming the sea and casting out demons into pigs related? Well, I'm going to show you here how they're related. Verses 28 and 29. And when he had come to the other side of the country, the Gadarenes, two men who were demon-possessed met him as they were coming out of the tombs. They were so exceedingly violent that no one could pass that road. Sound like some water that we just went through? Anybody? And behold, they cried out, saying, "What do we have to do with you, Son of God? Have you come here to torment us before the time," or before the appointed time of judgment? Do you see what Matthew is doing here? He didn't directly answer the question that was just asked, right? What was just asked? What kind of man is this? That was the question that was asked, that even the winds and the waves obey him. But he tells the answer with a story. The voice of the spiritual evil inside of these men answer the question of the last section with another question. And it has some very important language in this question, so I want to get down deep inside of this exorcism thing about what's going on here. Jesus' own followers don't even grasp who he is, but these demons do. And the demons know what time it is. They know that Jesus has come to destroy evil. That would be them. And that their time is short
because Jesus is here announcing the kingdom. He's taking care of the evil as he goes. So I have to kind of come clean with everybody. So let me just tell you up front that these stories are not designed to make us feel warm and fuzzy, right? Jesus is going to take care of all evil in the world, right? Because I can assure you that when some of these people realized the magnitude of what just happened, they wanted nothing to do with it. What does it say at the end of, after he sends out the demons? And the herdsmen went away into the city and reported everything, including the incidents with the demoniacs. And behold, the whole city came out to meet Jesus, and when they saw him, they entreated him to depart their region. They wanted nothing to do with this powerful man because they knew nothing about his power. They didn't know whether he was good or not, right? And so this is the first of 5 stories in Matthew that are very similar. I've got the other ones listed here, the other exorcisms. There's one more in chapter 9 that we're going to look at next week. And I just want to kind of scratch the surface of the topic here of what it means to be demon-possessed. We're going to get a little bit further into it in the future, but especially you have to remember where we're at culturally, because we have a lot of things baked into us about what demons are and what they look like, and they're little red men with horns and a pointed tail, and so we really need to open our minds to the Bible and see what it actually says about the nature of evil. In Western, and especially Americanized culture, has this contradiction inside of it, right? There's this idea of reality that says that if it can't be detected by microscopes or math, then it isn't real. But there's this huge and growing category, the largest category of people in the United States right now, actually, that's growing, is people who are spiritual but don't claim to be religious. This would be the negative evil or the negative energy people or evil energy type folks. It's very nebulous. And let me just say, the Bible doesn't speak in either one of those languages. It doesn't speak of negative energy, aura clouds around us, those types of things. It doesn't speak of little men with horns hopping inside of people, making them do bad things either, because that's not what's going on here. The Bible doesn't speak in those languages. It speaks of something more profound and something that transcends both the literalist view of or naturalist view, that only things that are observable are real. It speaks of something that is far more profound. In the biblical worldview, evil is it's more than just the bad and horrible and stupid things we do to each other. In the Bible, there's something at work in and through those dumb and horrible things that we do to each other, but more importantly, there's something that is at work behind those evil things that we do to each other. This something is real, it is tangible, but it is also transcendent. It is not detectable by our 5 senses. It's beyond our total ability to grasp. And so evil has a reality that is personal. I'm not saying that evil is this nebulous thing out there. That's not what I'm saying. That personal reality that evil has is at work, stirring up all kinds of death and destruction in our human relationships. These beings that are being talked about here are anti-life. They are against life. Jesus is the creator of life. God being the creator of all that is good in the world. And these beings are anti-good. They are anti-life. And so the Bible's claim is actually that evil is not natural to humans. Evil is a parasite on what God intended to be good. We are made in God's good image, right? This world has gone terribly and horribly wrong by our own choices, but it's not only our choices. The Bible claims that there is another reality that is influencing us. And I'm not saying the devil made you do it. That's not what I'm saying. But I am saying there is a tangible aspect of evil having an influence on the world. And even to the point of where we read here in Matthew chapter 8, that there's times when an individual can get so hijacked by evil, so to speak, that a person becomes irrational, that a person becomes so self-destructive and destructive to other people. And in modern times, we tend to attribute all of this to mental illness or something else similar. But there's many times it has to do with something else that even the doctors cannot describe what's going on. And the only cure for that is prayers offered in the name of Jesus. In the Bible, Jesus comes to confront evil. In the story and the power and the authority of Jesus, this comes out in a very gruesome way. Just like that coal burning Isaiah's lips. It's a very gruesome image. Jesus uses a single word to command the evil to leave these men. And what happens? The pigs run down this embankment and down into the water. Can you imagine? We got this, I mentioned it in the Bible class, we got this clean idea of pink little pigs with curly tails that are just happy-go-lucky, maybe named Wilbur, and they're just running off and going for a swim. That is not what's happening. There's thousands of pigs here that are squealing and grunting and gasping for air as they're dying. This is a gruesome scene. Can you imagine this violent and disturbing scene of thousands of pigs gasping and gurgling for air? Jesus is more concerned, though, about saving these two humans that he created through his own power and authority that these evil spirits have taken from his family. And everyone comes out to thank him, right? That's what happens? No. That's not what happens. They're terrified. This is a new side of Jesus that they didn't know could exist. All of their categories that they had for who God is and how things are cured are broken. They're blown up. And then we get this weird little section of just 4 verses that are like an interlude in between these stories that kind of break up the scene. There's a matching one in chapter 9 when Jesus calls Matthew, and they're both about discipleship. So these stories are full of meaning beyond just big and powerful Jesus or good moral teacher Jesus in chapters 5 through 7. But these followers already called him wise teacher. They called him prophet. And a few even called him the Messiah, right? But these new experiences are they're category-shattering experiences. They didn't have room for these in their mind, right? Jesus is now unquestionably the human embodiment of the one true creator God who has the power to still the sea. And these stories are making a claim about who Jesus is and his purpose here on earth. He is come to make a way through the chaotic waters of life to salvation. And these stories express the uncompromising authority. It's absolute authority of the demand that Jesus makes on his followers. And it's also a radical change in lifestyle, right? That following him has to involve. And so these people who are around Jesus are finally seeing who he is, and they have to rethink everything. They're disturbed. They're even terrified, it says there at the end of the chapter. They're terrified of who he is. He's not just a good moral teacher showing us the way. He's not just a powerful person. He's claiming to be the one true God of Israel who has come among us in the form of a man. He is the way. He doesn't just have power. He is the source of all power. the good and wise creator of all that exists. And he's here to confront evil at its spiritual source. And these stories are not meant to make us feel comfortable. They're meant to challenge us. So Jesus is the presence of God. And I think if we're going to bring all this together, the cumulative effect of these displays of power, of God-given authority in Christ, is no less powerful than that of the teachings of the Sermon on the Mount in chapters 5 through 7. And so chapters 5 through 7 and chapters 8 and 9, even though they're very differently constructed, they form this sort of matching pair. That together they leave no doubt that the story of Jesus in Galilee is the story of the Messiah, the Son of God, breaking in and breaking their categories that they have in their lives of his fellow countrymen, of Israel, and calling them to make a decision. And so he's calling them into fellowship with himself. He's healing. He's conquering the spiritual forces. He's mandating our discipleship. And so the question is, if he called them to decision, what will your decision be? Will you be willing to admit that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, the Son of the living God, who came to be the sacrifice for our sins? What is your decision? Will you admit that? Will you live that in your life? Will you live as a member of the kingdom? If you're willing to do that, you can be added to his kingdom through the waters of baptism. If you believe in God and you're willing to make a change in your life, and you're willing to go through the waters of baptism, to live your faith throughout your life, Jesus is willing to make you clean. And that's the lesson for this morning. It's good to have everyone here. Next week will be chapter 9 of Matthew. Thanks for joining us, everybody.